David, a young lawyer in his late 20s, was always in a rush. He had a busy schedule, with back-to-back meetings and a list of clients waiting for his attention. He thought he had everything under control: his career, his life, and his future. He was confident, maybe even a little too confident, and believed that anyone who wasn't as driven as he was didn't deserve his respect. He was the kind of person who walked through the busy streets of London with his head held high, eyes fixed on the goal ahead, and little regard for the people around him. One morning, as he was hurrying down a crowded street, he bumped into an elderly woman carrying heavy shopping bags. He barely noticed her at first. She was standing by the sidewalk, struggling to balance the bags in her frail hands. Her gray hair, tucked into a neat bun, and her worn-out coat made her look fragile, but David paid her no mind. He was running late for an important meeting and couldn't afford to waste time. Without thinking, David pushed past her, the cold wind of his hurried steps brushing against her. The old woman stumbled slightly but caught herself, her eyes following him with a look that was hard to ignore. He didn't see the look, though, as he was already too far ahead, lost in his own thoughts. To him, she was just another elderly woman, slow and unimportant. The city was full of them, and people like her didn't matter in the fast-paced world he lived in. But as he walked further down the street, something felt off. He glanced back quickly and saw the old woman standing still, staring after him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that made David feel uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. He shrugged it off. After all, he had a meeting to attend and no time to worry about strangers. As he reached the busy intersection, his mind was already racing ahead, planning his next steps for the day. The young lawyer had a big case coming up, and he was confident it would be his ticket to a higher position at the firm. He had no time to waste on any distractions. But just as he was about to cross the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, checking the screen. A text from his colleague reminded him that he had to pick up some documents before the meeting. It was then that David heard a soft voice calling out from behind him. "Excuse me, young man." The voice was quiet but firm, and David turned around, slightly annoyed. There was the old woman again, standing at the edge of the sidewalk. She had somehow caught up with him, her frail figure now standing in his way. David raised an eyebrow, already feeling irritated. "Yes?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. He had no patience for people who delayed him, especially for something as trivial as this. The woman didn't seem bothered by his cold response. "I need some help," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Could you help me with these bags? They're too heavy for me to carry on my own." David took a quick look at the bags, then at her, and let out a small sigh. He glanced at his watch, the minutes ticking away. He had a busy day, and helping this woman was not part of his plan. "I'm really sorry, but I'm in a hurry," he said quickly, ready to turn and walk away. But before he could take a step, the woman's eyes locked onto his, her gaze intense. It was as if she could see right through him. Her voice softened, but there was something about it that made David pause. "Please," she repeated, her voice calm, "just a moment of your time." David hesitated. His instincts told him to just walk away, but something in the old woman's voice stopped him. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange pull. He had a sudden urge to help her, to do the right thing, even though he didn't want to. He glanced around at the busy street and noticed that no one else was stopping to help her. Everyone seemed too busy, too focused on their own lives to care about a simple request. Reluctantly, David walked back toward her. "All right, fine," he said, his voice a little softer now, but still impatient. He took one of the bags from her, not really thinking much about it. The moment his fingers touched the handle, he could feel the weight of the bag, much heavier than he had expected. The old woman gave him a small smile of gratitude as they started walking together. As they made their way down the street, the woman talked to him in a soft, gentle voice. She shared a little about her life, how she had lived in the same small flat for years, how her family had moved away, and how she now spent most of her days alone. David listened, not because he cared, but because he didn't know what else to do. The silence between them was awkward, but something about her calm presence made him feel uneasy. When they reached her building, the woman paused at the entrance and turned to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice kind but carrying a weight that David couldn't quite understand. "You may not realize it, but today, you've made a difference." David didn't know what to say. He gave a half-hearted smile and nodded, then turned and walked away quickly. The encounter was over, and he could go back to his life, back to the important things, back to the business he was chasing. But as he walked down the street, the feeling of unease lingered. Something about the woman, her quiet strength, and her final words stayed with him. He shook it off. It was just a brief moment, nothing more. But deep down, David couldn't help but wonder, why had she looked at him that way? Why had she seemed so different from anyone else he had met before? David's life moved quickly, and the next few days were no exception. He didn't think much more about the elderly woman or their brief encounter. He had clients to meet, deadlines to hit, and a career to focus on. He was always looking ahead, constantly moving forward with the same determined mindset that had brought him success so far. But as the days went on, something about that woman's face kept resurfacing in his mind. It wasn't the kind of thing David liked to think about, but it lingered in the back of his mind, haunting him when he least expected it. His schedule was packed, but one afternoon, after a particularly long and exhausting day at the office, he found himself walking back down the same street where he had met the old woman. The city was as busy as ever, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. His steps slowed, and he found himself looking up at the same building where he had left her a few days ago. It was a small, unremarkable place, but something about it caught his attention. He hadn't meant to come this way. It was just the quickest route back to his office. But now he found himself standing outside, staring at it, almost as if drawn there by some invisible force. He stood there for a few moments, his mind racing. He didn't know why he had come back. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he wanted to make sure she was all right. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something about her that he hadn't quite understood the first time. Whatever it was, David found himself stepping forward, crossing the street, and heading toward the entrance of the building. He had no plan, no reason for being there, but his feet carried him toward the door. When he reached the entrance, he hesitated for a moment. The building was quiet, and there was no sign of the woman. He almost turned around, ready to forget the whole thing and move on. But then, just as he was about to leave, he saw her. Mrs. Thompson. She was standing by the door, just as she had before, and she was looking at him with those same piercing eyes. "Hello again, young man," she said, her voice as calm as ever. David stopped in his tracks, surprised by how much she had startled him. He hadn't expected to see her again, let alone in the same spot. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, his voice a little more hesitant than he wanted it to be. The old woman smiled, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile that made David feel like she knew something he didn't, something important. "You're here for a reason," she said softly, as though she could read his mind. "I don't know why, but you've come back. Perhaps you should listen to that feeling." David didn't know what to say. He felt a strange sense of discomfort, but he couldn't walk away now. Something about her words felt too real, too meaningful. "I'm just passing by," he said, though it sounded like an excuse even to him. Mrs. Thompson looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady and unblinking. "You've been disrespectful, haven't you?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp. David was taken aback by her question. It was as if she could see right through him, understand the kind of person he was. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little defensive. The old woman's smile faded, and her expression turned serious. "I've seen men like you before, full of arrogance, thinking the world owes them something. But there's more to life than just success and power. You'll learn that soon enough, my boy. And when you do, you'll understand why I'm saying this. David opened his mouth to protest, to tell her that he was doing just fine on his own. But the words didn't come. Instead, he stood there in silence, his chest tightening as he realized that she was right. Deep down, he knew that he hadn't always treated people the way he should have. He had always been too focused on his career, too driven to see the world around him. He had been blind to the struggles of others, dismissing them as unimportant, just like he had done with her. Before he could respond, Mrs. Thompson turned away, heading inside the building. "Think about it," she said over her shoulder. "You'll be back, and when you are, we'll see if you've changed." David stood there for a moment, staring after her. Her words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in a long while, he felt uncertain. What had just happened? Why did he feel this way? He didn't know the answers, but something inside him had shifted. Something deep down had stirred, and he couldn't ignore it. He turned and walked away, but this time, he wasn't rushing. He walked slowly, his mind swirling with questions. What was it that Mrs. Thompson knew? What lesson was she trying to teach him? And more importantly, why did he feel like he had just been given a glimpse of something that could change his entire life? For the first time in years, David wasn't thinking about his next big deal or his climb up the career ladder. He was thinking about something much more important, something that he hadn't even considered before. He was thinking about respect, about kindness, and about the world beyond his own ambitions. And he knew, deep down, that he hadn't heard the last of Mrs. Thompson. A few days later, David couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't a physical change, not something he could point to or explain easily. It was more like a shift inside him, a feeling that there was something he needed to understand, something he had missed before. It had been a week since his last encounter with Mrs. Thompson, and he had tried to put it out of his mind. But the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling grew. As he sat at his desk late one evening, going through some paperwork for a big case, he found himself staring at his phone, the message from his colleague earlier that morning still unread. It was just a reminder about a meeting tomorrow, but something about it caught his attention. It wasn't the meeting itself, but the mention of an inheritance case, a complicated one that he had heard about, but hadn't given much thought to. David's curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself scrolling through the details of the case. The more he read, the more intrigued he became. The case involved an elderly woman who had left behind a substantial fortune, but there was a twist. The fortune was not being passed on to her family or close relatives, but rather to someone who had been carefully chosen to inherit it. The name of the person who would receive the inheritance was not immediately clear, and that's where the mystery lay. David frowned, a thought nagging at the back of his mind. Could it be? Could this be the same woman he had helped just days ago? The more he read, the clearer it became. The woman's name was indeed Mrs. Thompson, and as the details of the case unfolded, David began to realize that the inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about something much more profound. Mrs. Thompson, in her old age, had carefully chosen someone to inherit her wealth who, she believed, needed it most. And now, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, that someone was David. The realization hit him like a wave. Mrs. Thompson hadn't just been an old woman asking for help with her shopping bags. She had been watching him, observing him, and somehow knew that he was the one who needed to change. Her words from their last encounter echoed in his mind. "You'll learn that soon enough, my boy. And when you do, you'll understand why I'm saying this." David's heart raced as the gravity of the situation sank in. What had he gotten himself into? What did Mrs. Thompson see in him that he hadn't seen in himself? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary inheritance case. This was a test, a challenge, and one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. The next morning, David sat in his office, waiting for the meeting to begin. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The case was supposed to be just another part of his career, something to win, something to add to his growing list of achievements. But now it felt different. The stakes felt higher, the pressure greater. Mrs. Thompson had made it clear that this wasn't just about money. It was about him, about his character, and about whether he could rise to the challenge she had set before him. As the meeting began, David tried to focus. He listened as the details of the case were laid out before him, but his mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Thompson. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had known something he didn't, something that would change his entire life. And as the meeting went on, David realized that he was no longer the arrogant young lawyer he had once been. He wasn't sure what had changed, but something deep inside him had shifted. By the time the meeting ended, David knew he had to see her again. He had to understand what this was all about. He had to find out why she had chosen him, why she had seen something in him that he hadn't even noticed himself. And so, he made up his mind. He would go to her, and he would listen. That afternoon, David made his way back to Mrs. Thompson's building. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he had to see her. He reached the door and hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the weight of the situation was heavy on his shoulders. When he stepped inside, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, as if the whole world had slowed down. Mrs. Thompson was waiting for him, sitting in the same chair by the window, looking out at the street. She didn't turn to face him, but somehow she knew he was there. "Come in, David," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I've been waiting for you." David swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew this was a moment that would change everything. "I don't understand," he said, his voice shaky. "Why me? Why did you choose me?" Mrs. Thompson turned slowly to face him, her expression unreadable. "Because you need to learn something important," she said. "You need to learn that life is more than just what you can take. It's about what you can give, what you can change in others, and how you treat the people around you." David listened in silence as she spoke, for the first time in a long time. He felt like he was hearing something that truly mattered. He didn't know what it all meant yet, but he was starting to understand that Mrs. Thompson's inheritance wasn't just about wealth. It was about wisdom, about growing as a person, and about discovering what it truly meant to live with purpose. And as he sat there, facing the woman who had somehow changed the course of his life, David realized that the journey he was about to embark on was one far more important than any career success or professional achievement. This was a journey of the heart. The days that followed were a blur for David. He couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Thompson had said, and no matter how hard he tried to focus on his work, her words kept echoing in his mind. He had always believed that success came from hard work, ambition, and never slowing down. But now he wasn't so sure. Was he truly living the life he wanted? Was he the person he wanted to be? The inheritance case had taken on a new meaning for him. It wasn't just a way to make more money or advance his career. It had become a test, one that challenged everything David had ever believed in. Every day, he found himself thinking more about Mrs. Thompson's lessons. Her calm demeanor, her wisdom, and her way of seeing the world differently had begun to shift his perspective. David had always been so focused on winning, on being the best, that he had never taken the time to understand the people around him. And now he realized how much he had missed. One afternoon, David sat in his office, staring at the file for the inheritance case. His colleagues had already started discussing strategies for winning the case, focusing solely on the technicalities and legal details. But David couldn't get past one question. What was Mrs. Thompson trying to teach him? It wasn't about winning at all. She had never asked him to win. She had asked him to listen, to care, to change. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the case wasn't just about legal documents or money. It was about understanding the bigger picture, about connecting with people on a deeper level, and about showing respect for those who had been forgotten or overlooked by society. He wasn't sure how to apply these lessons yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to go back and see Mrs. Thompson again. He needed to understand more, and he knew that she was the key to everything. The next morning, David made his way to the old woman's building once again. This time, he felt different. There was no arrogance in his steps, no rush to get somewhere. As he entered the building, the quietness of the space felt familiar, almost like he had come home. He stood at the door for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before knocking gently. Mrs. Thompson answered, her face lighting up with a warm, knowing smile. "You've come back," she said, as though she had been expecting him. David nodded, unsure of what to say. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice softer than usual. "About the case, about everything. I'm starting to realize that I've been living my life all wrong. I've been so focused on success and winning, but I've neglected the people around me. I haven't treated them with the respect they deserve. And now, I don't know what to do." Mrs. Thompson gestured for him to sit down beside her. And he did, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders as he spoke. "I don't even know where to start," he continued, his words flowing out. "I feel like I spent so much time pushing people away, only to realize that they were the ones who could teach me the most." Mrs. Thompson listened quietly, her eyes calm and patient, as though she knew exactly what he was feeling. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "You're beginning to understand, David. But there's something more. You've come this far, but you have a choice to make. You can keep living your life the way you've always known it, or you can choose to do something different. You can choose to change." David looked at her, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean by that? Change in what way?" The old woman's eyes sparkled as she leaned in slightly. "You've been given an opportunity. This case, this inheritance, it's not just about money. It's about what you're willing to do with it. You have the power to make a difference in the world around you. But it's not about gaining wealth or status. It's about what you can give. It's about how you use your position to help others." David sat back, stunned by her words. He had never thought about it that way. All this time, he had been so focused on himself, on his career, that he had forgotten that he could use his skills and his position to make a real difference. He had always viewed the world as something to conquer, but now he realized that it was something to be a part of, a world that needed respect, kindness, and understanding. "How do I do that?" he asked, feeling both overwhelmed and excited at the same time. Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. "Start small. Help the people who need it most. Use the resources you have to make their lives better, even if it's just in a small way. And always remember, true success comes from how you treat others, not how you treat yourself." David's heart felt lighter than it had in years. He was starting to understand what she meant. It wasn't about climbing to the top anymore. It was about building something lasting, something that would leave a positive impact on the world. And it started with the people around him. The ones he had once overlooked, the ones he had once been too arrogant to notice. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but in a good way. David knew that his path had changed, and though it would be difficult, he was ready to take it on. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, his respect for her growing even more. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've given me more than I could ever repay." Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened. "You don't have to repay me, David. Just remember what you've learned. And if you ever forget, I'll be here to remind you." David left her apartment feeling different, humbled, and with a clearer sense of purpose. The case was no longer just about winning. It was about doing the right thing, about understanding what truly mattered. As he walked down the street, he couldn't help but smile. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he was ready to face it with a new perspective, one that was grounded in respect, kindness, and the desire to help those around him. And he knew that, with Mrs. Thompson's guidance, he would never lose sight of what truly mattered again. The weeks that followed David's meeting with Mrs. Thompson were nothing short of transformative. The arrogant young lawyer who had once lived in pursuit of nothing but success had been replaced by someone more thoughtful, more considerate of the world and people around him. David found himself taking time to listen, truly listen, to those he had once brushed aside. His colleagues at work noticed the shift in him, and though it was subtle at first, they couldn't deny that there was something different about him. He wasn't just focused on making deals and winning cases. Now he took a genuine interest in the people he encountered, whether they were clients, staff members, or even strangers on the street. It wasn't easy, and the old habits didn't disappear overnight. There were times when David still found himself falling into the trap of his old ways, the rush to meet deadlines, the obsession with proving himself, the competitive drive that had always pushed him forward. But each time he slipped, he thought about Mrs. Thompson's words, about the lessons she had imparted, and it was as if a little light flickered in his mind, reminding him to refocus. Slowly but surely, he was becoming someone who valued people over status, kindness over ambition, and respect over power. The inheritance case, which had once seemed like just another opportunity for David to prove his worth, had turned into something more meaningful. It wasn't just about getting the money to the right person. It was about ensuring that Mrs. Thompson's legacy would live on in a way that truly honored her life and her beliefs. David pored over the details of the case with more care than he had ever given any other case before. He began to see the intricacies of it all, the way each person involved had a story, a struggle, a need that extended beyond money or property. And though David was still in charge of the legal matters, he knew now that his true job was to ensure that Mrs. Thompson's wishes would be fulfilled with the same compassion she had shown him. Then one day, David received a phone call that he had not expected. It was from Mrs. Thompson's lawyer. The case was almost at its final stages, and it seemed that there was just one last piece of business to address. Mrs. Thompson, as it turned out, had left a letter for David, a final message for him that she had instructed the lawyer to deliver personally. David felt a mixture of curiosity and nerves as he sat down to read the letter. It was dated just a few days before their meeting, and as he began to read her elegant handwriting, he was once again struck by the depth of her wisdom. "My dear David," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I know that you have taken the first steps toward understanding the world in a new way. You've learned that success is not about how much you can take from others, but how much you can give. You've learned that people, no matter their age, status, or background, deserve respect, compassion, and kindness. You've learned that the true measure of a person is not in their career or wealth, but in the love and care they share with the world." David paused for a moment, feeling a lump form in his throat. Mrs. Thompson's words had always held such weight, but reading them now, he felt the full impact of her teachings. "I know you will face challenges ahead, and there will be times when it will be hard to stay true to what you've learned. But remember this, always choose kindness. Always choose respect. And never, ever forget the people who are quietly waiting for someone to notice them. The world is full of people who need your help, your support, and your heart. It's up to you to decide how you will use the gifts you've been given." David felt a tear slip down his cheek as he read the final words. "David, you have more potential than you realize. Don't waste it on ambition alone. Use it to make the world a better place, and you will find the true meaning of success. And remember, I will always be with you in spirit, guiding you, just as I promised." The letter ended, and David sat in silence, overwhelmed by the weight of Mrs. Thompson's words. He had come so far, but now he understood that the journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. That afternoon, David stood in front of the office window, looking out at the bustling city below. He had everything he had once dreamed of: a successful career, financial stability, and respect from his peers. But now he knew that there was more to life than these things. What mattered now was what he could give back to the world. He made a promise to himself that day. He would no longer chase after success for its own sake. Instead, he would pursue a life that honored the lessons Mrs. Thompson had taught him. One where compassion, kindness, and respect would guide every decision, every interaction, and he would use his position, his influence, and his resources to help those who needed it most. As David left his office that evening, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, he felt truly fulfilled. He was no longer the arrogant lawyer he had once been. He was someone different, someone who had learned the true meaning of success. And as he walked into the night, with a renewed sense of purpose, he couldn't help but think of Mrs. Thompson. He hadn't just inherited her wealth. He had inherited her wisdom, her values, and her heart, and he would carry them with him for the rest of his life. David was ready for the journey ahead, a journey that would take him places he had never imagined. And as he moved forward, he knew that, no matter where life took him, he would always remember the lessons of the old woman who had changed everything. Months passed, and David's life began to change in ways he had never anticipated. The transformation he had undergone wasn't just about becoming a better lawyer. It was about becoming a better person. His colleagues, who had once seen him as nothing more than an ambitious young man, started to look at him differently. They saw a man who was more grounded, more compassionate, and more willing to listen. David found himself genuinely invested in the well-being of his clients, ensuring that their needs were heard and met. He even began to take on pro bono cases, helping those who couldn't afford high-priced legal representation. It wasn't about making a name for himself anymore. It was about making a difference. And yet, the shadow of Mrs. Thompson lingered over him, guiding him. He had kept his promise to her. He had worked to use his success to help others, and he was beginning to see the fruits of his labor. But there were still moments when he doubted himself. Would he be able to keep going? Was he truly changing, or was this just a phase? One day, David received a call that took him by surprise. It was from an old friend, Tom, who had worked with him years ago at the firm. Tom had heard about David's shift in attitude and wanted to meet up. David was curious but hesitant. They hadn't spoken much since he had started to change his ways, and he wondered what this meeting would be like. Would Tom understand? Or would he think David had lost his edge? The meeting was set for that afternoon, and as David walked into the cafe where they had agreed to meet, he saw Tom sitting at a corner table. Tom looked almost the same, his suit sharp, his smile wide, but there was something about the way he was sitting that made David pause. It was the same posture, the same confident demeanor he had once carried himself with. The man he used to be. "David," Tom said with enthusiasm, standing up to shake his hand. "It's good to see you, man. It's been too long." David smiled, sitting down. "It really has," he agreed. "How have you been?" "Busy, climbing the ladder. Same old stuff. But I've heard things about you, David," Tom said, leaning forward. "I've heard that you've changed." David was silent for a moment. He had expected Tom to bring it up, but hearing the words from an old friend felt different. "I have," he said softly. "I've learned a lot over the past few months. A lot about life, and a lot about myself." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Learned a lot? About what?" David sighed, his eyes lowering. He could feel a weight settling in his chest as he tried to explain. "About priorities. About what truly matters. I spent so much time focusing on ambition and success that I forgot about the people around me. I didn't really care about them. I only cared about how I looked, how much I was winning. But now I realize it's about something more. It's about being there for people. It's about giving back." Tom leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, David. That sounds like a nice idea, but does it really work in the real world? We live in a competitive world. You can't just throw all that away. You've got to keep fighting to stay ahead, or someone else will take your place." David looked at his old friend, the man he once had so much in common with. "I thought that too," he said quietly. "But I've realized that it's not about fighting to stay ahead. It's about lifting others up, helping them, instead of trying to be better than them." Tom stared at him for a moment, his expression mixed with confusion and skepticism. "So, what now? Are you giving up on your career? Just handing it all over to someone else?" "No," David replied, shaking his head. "I'm not giving up. but I'm changing how I approach everything. It's not just about closing deals and winning cases. It's about making a real difference in people's lives." For a long moment, the two men sat in silence. Tom seemed to be processing what David had said, but there was a certain distance between them now. The gap that had once felt like a shared dream of success now seemed like an insurmountable divide. Finally, Tom broke the silence with a forced chuckle. "Well, I don't know if I'll ever get there," he said, sipping his coffee. "But I admire what you're doing, David. Really, I do." David gave a small smile, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over him. "I don't expect anyone to understand," he said softly. "But I found peace in this change. It's hard. It's not easy. But I know I'm doing the right thing." As the conversation continued, David felt a sense of sadness wash over him. He realized that not everyone would follow the same path he had chosen. He couldn't force anyone to change their mindset, just as he couldn't have been forced to change his own. But he also understood that he had made the right decision for himself, and that was enough. Later that day, as David walked back to his office, he thought about Mrs. Thompson and the lessons she had shared with him. He had learned to see the world through her eyes, to understand that success wasn't just about climbing the ladder, it was about how you treated the people you met along the way. As he walked past the familiar streets, the weight of his newfound purpose felt lighter. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt, but David knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the arrogant young lawyer he once was. He was a man who had found a new way to live, and it had made all the difference in his world. When David returned to his office, he sat at his desk and looked at the case files before him. The work was the same, but his perspective had shifted. He knew now that it wasn't about simply winning. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Mrs. Thompson had been right all along. True success came from giving, not taking. And with that thought, David smiled, ready to face whatever came next. As David sat at his desk, looking over the files in front of him, he felt a sense of calm wash over him that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The work he did had always been demanding, filled with high-stakes decisions and intense negotiations. But now there was something different in the air, something he couldn't quite put into words. His mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Thompson, the lessons she had imparted to him, and how far he had come since their first meeting. The day after his conversation with Tom, David had continued to reflect on their discussion. He had always prided himself on being able to make quick decisions, to think on his feet, and stay one step ahead. But the world didn't always work the way he had imagined. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that success in life wasn't something that could be measured by wealth, power, or status. True success, as Mrs. Thompson had shown him, was about making meaningful connections with others, lifting them up, and sharing your knowledge, resources, and love. That morning, David had received an unexpected phone call from an old acquaintance, someone who had heard about his change in attitude and wanted to talk. The woman on the other end of the line introduced herself as Claire, a longtime friend of Mrs. Thompson. "I'm sure you remember my dear friend," Claire said softly. "She spoke of you often. I've been meaning to reach out to you for some time now, David. There's something I'd like to discuss." David's curiosity was piqued, and he agreed to meet Claire at her office the next day. When he arrived, he was greeted by a warm, welcoming smile from a woman in her late 50s. Her eyes, much like Mrs. Thompson's, were filled with wisdom. After exchanging pleasantries, Claire wasted no time getting to the point. "I know you've been working hard to continue Mrs. Thompson's legacy," she said, "and I wanted to tell you something. Something that you might not know about her." David leaned in, intrigued. "What is it?" Claire took a deep breath before continuing. Before she passed, Mrs. Thompson was working on a charity project. She wanted to create a foundation, one that would help provide resources for underprivileged children who could not afford a good education. She believed deeply in the power of knowledge and wanted to give those children the opportunity to achieve their dreams, no matter where they came from. David was speechless. He had known that Mrs. Thompson had been kind-hearted, but he hadn't realized just how much she had planned to give back. Claire continued. She had already made some moves behind the scenes, but she left a letter for you, just like the one she gave to me. She trusted you with something important, David. This foundation, it's yours now. She wanted you to carry it forward. David's heart skipped a beat. Me. But I'm not. I know, Claire said, cutting him off with a smile. You weren't expecting this, but she saw something in you that you may not yet see in yourself. She saw a man capable of great change. You've already proven that by the way you've transformed. Now it's time to make a real, lasting difference. Will you carry on her legacy? David stared at the documents in front of him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Claire had just said. The foundation, Mrs. Thompson's legacy, it was all now in his hands. For a moment, he felt a wave of doubt rush over him. Was he ready for this? Could he really make a difference? But then, as if guided by some unseen force, David thought back to everything he had learned from Mrs. Thompson, the way she had shown him that life wasn't about success in the traditional sense. It was about love, about caring for others, and about making the world a better place. He could already see the impact her wisdom had had on him. And now, he was being given the chance to extend that same opportunity to others. With a deep breath, David stood up, his resolve hardening. Yes, he said, his voice steady. I'll do it. I'll carry on her work. Claire smiled warmly at him. I knew you would. The next few months were a whirlwind for David. With Claire's help, he began organizing the foundation, reaching out to donors, and partnering with schools and communities in need. The process wasn't always easy. There were legal hurdles to navigate, logistical challenges to overcome, and moments when he questioned whether he was doing enough. But with every step, David felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He was finally doing something that mattered. Word of the foundation spread quickly, and soon, David was meeting with families, teachers and children who were directly impacted by the work he was doing. The smiles on their faces, the gratitude in their eyes, were the things he had once sought in his career. But now, he knew they were the things that truly mattered. As the foundation grew, so did David. He continued his work as a lawyer, but his perspective had shifted completely. His career wasn't just about winning cases anymore. It was about ensuring that people received fair treatment, that they were heard, and that they had the opportunity to succeed in their own right. One day, as David sat at his desk, reviewing a new proposal for the foundation, he received another phone call, this time from a reporter who had heard about the work he was doing. The reporter asked if he would be willing to do an interview about his transformation and the foundation. David hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. But then he thought of Mrs. Thompson. She would have wanted him to share her story, to inspire others to make a difference. So, with a smile, he agreed to the interview. The reporter's questions were probing, but David answered them with a calm confidence he had never felt before. He spoke about his journey, about Mrs. Thompson's influence on his life, and about the foundation's mission to give children a chance at a better future. As the interview wrapped up, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had come full circle. From the arrogant young lawyer who cared only about success, to the man who had found purpose in helping others. David knew that this was just the beginning. He wasn't done yet, but he was ready for whatever came next. And as he looked out his office window at the city below, he realized that the world was full of opportunities to do good. He didn't have to climb the ladder anymore. He could build something that would help others climb too. David had found his true calling, and it was more than he had ever imagined.